And we're live. Okay. Welcome back to episode, what was this, 4? 3? What are we on here? We've already forgotten. This is 4. Episode 4, Leadership Laboratory. This morning, we're going to do a deep dive into some more layers of leadership psychology and performance and influence. But this time, we're going to unpack a really interesting study in what I would say is somewhat controversial. It was done in Finland by a bunch of Finnish scientists on military cadets at one of Finland's military academies. This was interesting because I think it provides or proposes some challenges to how most people think about charisma and confidence and what it really means to emerge as a leader amongst your peers. So, a little bit about the authors. This was done by, I'm going to mess these names up here, Sampo Paunonen, Jukka Emil Lundqvist, Markku Verkasalo, Sointulikas, Vesa Nissinen, bunch of Finns. But it was published in 2006 in the Leadership Quarterly. It used a sample of military cadets who are all undergoing officer training. And one of the things I think this makes this study interesting is because military environments, particularly military training environments, intentionally amplify pressure and emphasize performance and consider peer dynamics as they're looking to train military cadets, whether they're officers or enlisted. And it's a simulated high stakes leadership lab, unfolding in real life. So let's start by defining a few of the terms that these guys talk about in their study. First, they acknowledge that leadership emergence is not the same thing as leadership performance. And I've been talking about this the last 3 streams when I'm dealing with narcissism and leadership emergence and topics like that. So emergence can be thought of as being seen as a leader. It's gaining influence, it's accumulating authority, it's gaining respect from your peers and your subordinates and your supervisors. And this is regardless, to some degree at least, of whether or not you're actually good at leading, because there's a somewhat different journey emerging as a leader than it is performing as a leader once you're there. And as we've been discussing the last 3 streams, people with narcissistic traits tend to emerge as leaders more often than we might expect, and perhaps more often than we would hope. So the question that these scientists kind of pose underneath everything is this good or is this bad? So this study identifies a range of traits associated with narcissism. So they list them as high self-confidence, vanity, which is a new one for us in this stream, belief in their own superiority, the need for recognition and power, a sense of entitlement, egotism, exhibitionism, which is another new one that we haven't talked about yet, manipulativeness, and then impression management, which is another new one and is kind of is a pillar of what this study discusses with these military cadets. But here's the nuance that this study talks about and that I've been talking about in the past couple streams. Narcissism isn't all bad. It needs to be contextualized. So the researchers go on to point out that some narcissists are in fact psychologically healthy and are in fact functional and can in fact lead really well and emerge really quickly as leaders. So part of the reason that they can do this is their psychological disposition that makes them confident and bold and charismatic also makes them have low anxiety. It tends to give them lower depression rates. It gives them high self-esteem, and they have a drive for achievement and control, which lends itself really well to positions of leadership. And it lends itself really well to performing in positions of leadership as long as that drive for achievement and control is, oriented in a benevolent manner. And these scientists label this as a benign or a bright side of narcissism. So they're going to use that. They're going to use those words interchangeably in this study. And so for the rest of this stream, that's how I'm going to use them too. Contrast this with the dark side of leadership, or the negative sides, or the maladaptive sides, whatever way you want to put it, which is the exploitativeness, the manipulativeness, fake charm, and image obsession or impression management. So being overly concerned with how people view you. So it's not a binary thing. They make a note that narcissism is a spectrum. And I think that checks out with my own personal experience observing narcissism, studying narcissism to some rudimentary degree. Some leaders can leverage their narcissism to project strength, and others hide it with, toxicity. So as far as the study goes, this study involved a sample of 217 Finnish military cadets who were all undergoing officer training at the Finnish National Defense College. I'm not sure where that is, but it's obviously one of their service academies or their commissioning sources. But it used a really clever and interesting multi-layer design. So again, the sample was all Finnish military cadets, and they completed a battery of standardized personality tests, each designed to analyze different psychological dimensions that the authors assumed were relevant to leadership emergence. The first one was the Big Five personality trait, and this uses the NEO 5-factor inventory, which measures 5 broad domains of personality. There's extroversion, which is your outgoingness and your gregariousness, and how much being around people gives you energy. There's agreeableness, which is how willing you are to stand your ground and engage in either mental or physical conflict. There's conscientiousness, which the 2 dimensions of conscientiousness is orderliness and industriousness. So how organized you are and how much you work for the sake of work. Neuroticism, which is your response to negative emotion. And then openness to experience, which is your intelligence and your creativity and your ability to deal with complexity and generate new and useful ideas. So one sample question that they asked these cadets trying to measure extroversion is, I see myself as someone who is outgoing and sociable. So they would ask, this test would ask questions like that to try to measure those 5 broad domains of personality. The next battery of tests that they used was aimed to measure egotism and manipulativeness. And they used the supernumerary personality inventory. Egotism in this battery of tests measures an individual's confidence and willingness to self-enhance. So a sample item would read something like, I would rate myself as above average in most areas. And then manipulativeness in this test measures strategic influence. So a sample question would read something like, I will pretend to be extremely interested in what a person is saying in order to get something. The next battery test that this study used was called the Rosenberg Self-Esteem Scale. And this assesses a person's global self-worth by measuring positive and negative feelings about the self. So one sample question from the test was, on the whole, I am satisfied with myself. And then the last battery of tests that they used that had that is an official validated battery of tests was the Rosenberg Self-Esteem Scale. And, the Paul House Balanced Inventory of Desirable Responding, which I've never heard of that one. This measures social desirability bias, and in 2 includes two key components. So first is the impression management scale, which is aimed at detecting deliberate efforts on behalf of the individual to present oneself favorably to other people. One sample question from the test was, I never swear. And then they also used a self-deceptive enhancement scale in this test, which captures a person's unconscious self-enhancement or an overly positive self-perception. So a sample question from the study was, I am fully in control of my own fate. So that was the first phase of the study. And then they moved on to the second phase. And so, and this is something that I thought was really interesting about the study. Without warning the cadets all received a sealed envelope that contained a list of all their, this study called them platoon members, however they were organized, squad members, unit members, and they were asked to rate their peers on several following dimensions. One was leadership, two was popularity, three was benevolence, four was aggression, and five was honesty. So for leadership, they asked questions like, to what extent does this person take initiative and influence the group? In terms of popularity, they asked questions like, how well liked is this individual by others in the group? In terms of benevolence, they asked, does this person show kindness or concern for others? To measure aggression, they asked questions like, how often does this person act in a hostile or confrontational manner? And then lastly, for honesty, they asked, can this person be trusted to act ethically and tell the truth? So each cadet rated all their peers using a Likert scale response, which is usually measured on a number scale, typically 1 through 5 or 1 through 7. It usually goes back and forth between those two. And then these scores were then aggregated from all the cadets and analyzed alongside all their self-reported personality data. And the scientists argue that they use this setup to ensure that they got empirical data in terms of the personality tests, and then to ensure that the self-reports weren't biased by social pressure, and the peer ratings reflected genuine in-context impressions formed through day-to-day interactions without, or with at least minimizing any outside influence on how they rated people. And they found some really interesting stuff. The leaders rated highly by their peers were all high in extroversion. They were all high in conscientiousness. They were low in neuroticism. They were high in self-esteem, and they were high in egotism. However, they were not high in manipulativeness and impression management. Extroversion had an R of 0.34. Conscientiousness had an R of 0.3. Low neuroticism had an R of negative 0.25. Self-esteem had an R of 0.38. And then egotism had an R value of 0.41. Manipulativeness was negative 0.18, and impression management was negative 0.22. And in these studies, or in statistics, R stands for the correlation coefficient, which is a measure of strength and direction of a relationship between two independent variables. And so a value of close to 1 means a strong positive correlation, and a value close to -1 means a strong negative correlation. And then a value near 0 means 0 correlation. So in this study, for example, egotism had an R value of 0.41, which demonstrates a strong positive link to being seen as a leader, while impression management, which had an R value of negative 0.2, showed a -1. And if you convert this correlation into a shared variance, you basically take the square root of it. So if you take an R value of 0.41 from egotism, this explains roughly 17% of the variance in peer-related leadership. So these things by themselves don't measure a significant portion of leadership, but if you collect them all together, you're going to get a variance that approaches 1 or approaches 100%. And so the scientists that did this study argue that these traits don't just matter; they're empirically, statistically significant contributors to leadership emergence, even if they're not statistically significant contributors to leadership performance after the fact, which gives us one of the powerful insights from this study. And that is charisma, when it comes to leadership emergence, works, but only if it's trusted by the peers. So at this point in the study, they've explained, why they're doing the study, how they conducted the study, and then they get into why their study indicates that peer evaluations matter more than interviews. So those of you in HR, leadership selection processes, promotion boards, whether it's military or corporate or what have you, this study suggests that peer ratings may be more reliable than traditional interviews or supervisor evaluations when it comes to identifying someone's true leadership potential. And the reason is, this study suggests, at least, that peers see the unfiltered version of a person, and they witness someone how behaves under pressure, off camera, in real time, without any impression management strategies. And then conversely, interviewers will only see the polished version of someone. And this is especially true if the candidate is skilled at impression management, which narcissists tend to be. So the authors contend that organizations need to rethink how they assess leadership, because the charisma in an interview room doesn't always translate to real world effectiveness. In terms of my own experience with peer evaluations, I mean, the special operations community that I came from, we used peer evaluations and all sorts of versions of it over the course of my career. And they weren't exclusively used for leadership selection, at least officially, but once you have the data, it's really hard for leadership not to incorporate it into their decision making about leadership evaluations. It was supposed to be non-punitive, at least the version that was being used when I left late last year, and it generally wasn't, as long as the feedback you got in your peer evaluations or your evaluations from your subordinates was taken seriously and seriously considered, and you made an effort to figure out why you were getting the evaluations that you were, and you made an effort to rectify the discrepancies between your evaluations and your actual performance. Another thing that I've observed with peer evaluations is that, or evaluations in general, is that depending on where the individual's at relative to you in the organizational hierarchy, their perspective on what's important and how it relates to how they evaluate you can be quite different. So, people that are able to impress their leadership and their chain of command can completely lose the respect of their teammates and their subordinates due to the arrogance and manipulation and lack of accountability that they display downward. However, because of their ability to impression manage upward, they're able to still continue to have the trust and impress their leadership. But yet there's quiet professionals who rise into the trusted leadership roles because they've earned respect from the ground up. And while they may not be moved into higher positions of leadership formally, their influence increases commensurate with the amount of respect that they've earned. And unfortunately, it's not always recognized. I remember one guy that I worked with, he was on his, he had multiple interviews for a really coveted position, and he was on his third interview, which was, I think, his last chance, and the organization hadn't given him the promotion that he was after, and if he didn't get it on this last chance, the organization was going to process him out, which would have been an absolute tragedy because he was so respected amongst his peers and he was so respected amongst his subordinates. But because he was a quiet professional and he wasn't super gregarious with the leadership and some of the roles that he had done prior, although he did them exceptionally well, they weren't necessarily looked at as worthy as other roles he might have been in, and he almost didn't get the job. So in any case, I think there's three environments that we can kind of extrapolate this data to. And one's obviously the military, and based on this study and based on my own career in the military, confidence and self-esteem from a leader is absolutely critical. However, leaders who manipulate or fake their persona quickly lose trust from their subordinates. And I think this is amplified in the military because most of the time in the military, you're traveling, you're training, you're spending so much time with your team, both in a work environment and then, like in terms of downtime, that you can't, even a narcissist can't hide their character forever. You're just around your people too much to be anything but your authentic self and the best version of yourself. So being anybody that you're not for an extended period of time, or trying to impression manage for too long and trying to look good to everyone around you, up, down, and your peers, it's not replicable over the amount of time that you're with a particular unit. In terms of the corporate world, now I say this with humility because I've never done anything corporate, but I would imagine, and this study claims, that high-performing professionals climb faster because they look and they sound confident. But obviously that's built on manipulation, and if left unchecked, the team is going to suffer and engagement is going to drop and turnover is going to rise. Now in the military, you can't leave unless your contract is up or you resign your commission. So while turnover might not rise, this team is certainly still going to suffer, and engagement is definitely going to drop, and buy-in is going to drop, and ownership is going to drop. On the political scale, which these authors suggest that it's perhaps the ultimate stage for this impression management that they're talking about, leaders are obviously rewarded for their charisma, but they may still eventually be exposed by their peers and advisors and the public. However, I think in politics, it is the ultimate stage for impression management. Sorry. It is the ultimate stage for impression management. But I don't think they suffer quite as much as the corporate world and the military world, because these politicians have such a powerful PR arm behind them, whether it's their personal one of staffers or the relationship with certain news outlets or, the main news outlets in particular who are partisan in nature and are going to take one side or the other almost no matter what. So in any case, all three arenas, this study makes it pretty clear that narcissists with authentic self-belief often thrive in terms of emerging as a leader, but those driven by manipulation and ego tend to burn out and implode over the long course once they're in a leadership position and they're required to perform and to influence in a positive way. So this study proposes four key takeaways that I'm going to review for you guys. The first is that not all narcissists are toxic. There is a benign or perhaps even benevolent side of narcissism, although it's somewhat uncommon. The confidence and drive and charisma can be really powerful in leadership. Yeah. Yeah, when you dig into like the narcissism leadership and you recognize a little bit of narcissism in yourself, you're like, ugh, I need to do some some soul searching. But it's there's no doubt that being a narcissist or having some narcissistic tendencies is going to help you accumulate influence and help you accumulate authority and power in whatever medium that you're pursuing it in. But I also think it's pretty clear based on the literature that I've seen and based on my own personal experience, it's really hard to check that narcissism over the long run. And it's really hard for you to continue to be the same narcissist or display the same narcissistic traits that helped you rise quickly and still lead and influence in a positive, benevolent way. It's not impossible. It takes some self-imposed humility. I was talking about a couple things last night that, having mentors that ground you and that are willing to be candid with you is going to help you with that. And then putting in processes and systems to make sure that you're not overly confident in yourself without doing your due diligence, which is a tendency of narcissists. They tend to be overconfident in themselves despite their mistakes and despite their shortcomings and despite their lack of competence. So if you have a big ego and you are narcissistic, it can be a superpower as long as you work your tail off to justify it and you put in some systems and measures in place to make sure that you're being checked by people that you trust and that people are willing to be candid with you and people that you're willing to consider and integrate their evaluations of you in order to continue to improve yourself. Next takeaway is, according to these authors, is that manipulation kills trust. And I would agree with that, at least from a malevolent manipulation. Every time we communicate, we're attempting to manipulate someone, but that doesn't mean that manipulation is malevolent in nature. It can be benevolent. And so high performing people with a lot of charisma can sabotage themselves if they're also high in impression management, meaning they're going to be seen as fake and self-serving. Next is that peer feedback really matters in terms of leadership evaluation, and it's really indicative of leadership emergence, at least according to this study. And I would say that that takeaway is pretty sound in terms of my own personal experience. But these authors go as far as to say that it could perhaps be the most accurate lens for evaluating leadership potential, at least early on in someone's leadership career. Now, as you climb the organizational ladder, whether you're corporate or military or political, competence is going to become more and more important in terms of leadership evaluation. But peer feedback should never be discounted. The other thing that's interesting about peer feedback in earlier on in someone's career is that the more junior you are, the more peers you're tend to going to have. So as you climb an organizational ladder, there's just less and less positions as that pyramid continues to get narrower and narrower as you climb to the top. So there's just less data available from a peer feedback perspective. There's less people over you, there's less people around you, and there's way more people underneath you. So it makes for an interesting dynamic in terms of using peer feedback earlier on in someone's leadership journey, because the more data just makes it a more solid evaluation overall. Lastly is that the authors contend that self-awareness is critical. So, ask yourself, are you projecting confidence? Are you overcompensating? Are you inspiring others in attempting to be constructive and benevolent, or are you managing your image because you want to be seen as something, whatever that may be? So asking yourself, what kind of influence are you really projecting to your peers and to your subordinates and to those above you, and how it's being received? So we only got a couple live viewers, and that's okay. At this point, I'm okay with talking to my screen by myself. But if you're watching the replay, drop some questions in the chat. Oh, yeah, I forgot I had it up. Do you guys think, being a narcissist can make you a good leader? Have you ever worked with narcissists? What happened? And should organizations rely more on peer ratings during promotions? It's 30 minutes. That's not so bad. If I had more people in the chat, I could make these longer, but such is life. That's going to be it for the study. So if anybody has any questions, drop them in the chat. How do you know if you're a narc? I assume you mean narcissist. So the traits that are most often associated with narcissism from a they use at least in a non-clinical sample, they'll use the narcissistic personality inventory. So this is like the everyday person who isn't in a psych ward for narcissistic personality disorder. But anyways, those traits that are most highly associated with narcissism are going to be extreme self-confidence. There's going to be vanity, belief in their own superiority relative to others, belief in the inferiority of people around them. They're going to have a need for recognition and power. They're going to have a sense of entitlement. There's going to be a substantial degree of egotism, some degree of exhibitionism. They're going to have at least a willingness to be manipulative, even if they don't actually uh, actively manipulate people or frequently manipulate people. There's a part of the narcissist that is at least acknowledges the willingness to be one or to be manipulative, and then they're going to be high in impression management. So, and that's not quite the same as protecting your reputation. It's that they are constantly and intentionally changing their behavior around other people according to what they think that individual or that group of people wants to see out of them. They're also going to be, but this isn't exclusive to, the dysfunctional narcissist. They're also going to be really low in anxiety. They're also going to be low in depression, and they're also going to be really high in self-esteem, and they're going to have a high drive for achievement and control. So, those things aren't exclusive to the more destructive side of narcissism, but they're certainly going to exist in both sides. But they can also exist in like the benign or benevolent narcissist. You doing some soul searching, John? Yeah, it looks like. Yeah, the classic non-clinical narcissists, according to at least the literature that I've been exposed to, um, they're they're going to have an almost unwavering confidence in themselves, despite whatever, however high or low their performance is, which kind of makes uh, their it makes their rise to leadership really fast. But once they're in a position of leadership or in a position of influence, it can fall apart quite quickly, because people start to look for different things in a leader once you're there. One's character, the other's performance. They need to trust you with what you're doing. So if your belief in yourself and your performance don't match up, and you refuse to acknowledge that performance discrepancy despite your attitude, which is common in the non-clinical narcissist and clinical narcissist, that is going to really be destructive to your ability to influence. Yeah, same. I'm over here on welfare talking to myself in front of the computer, so I feel you on that. Thanks, buddy. I put on my work clothes today. I think I'm gonna call it. I'm gonna get some breakfast, get a little workout in, come back and work on the computer for a bit. I'll do another stream later this evening, probably do it during Eastern time commute hours, maybe 6:30, 7:30, something like that. So I'll catch you guys later.